This video is sponsored by Brush Galaxy. Okay, how would you feel if you could draw this image too? Well, I'm going to break it down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine, so that you can have a go and amaze yourself. Okay, so as I explained in the intro, I'm going to show you the step-by-step approach so that you learn the painting techniques as well as the app that I'm using, PROCREATE. But that doesn't mean you can't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along. But within the app PROCREATE, I'm using the default A4 canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. And in terms of the color profile within PROCREATE 2, I'm using the sRGB, and it's the code that ends in 2.1, and it's here on the list. I'm going to be using the brushes that come free with the app PROCREATE, and I'm going to be using within airbrushing the soft brush, maybe the medium brush. Within organic, I'm going to be using the rainforest brush and the paper daisy brush. And within luminance, I'm going to be using the light pen. In terms of the colors, I've already pre-selected a color palette here. Now each of these colors has linked to it associated with it. If you go down to value, you'll see here hexadecimal. So each of the colors has a code, a hexadecimal code associated with it. And down in the video description, each of these codes are located. So you can take a note of them, type them into this box one at a time, press enter and the color appears up here. And then you can piece it together yourself. Or next to those codes is a link that takes you to my Patreon page, and you can download the whole color file for free to save you some time. And obviously Patreon is the place where you can go and support this channel and gain access to extended versions of these tutorials and other exclusive content. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people who have in the past or who are currently supporting this channel. It's made a huge difference in enabling me to continue doing what I do here. So sincerely, a huge thank you. Okay, and with all that said and done, we're going to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do on my first layer is go to the first color on the top row and just drag from the circle into the canvas to flood fill that whole area. Then go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 2. We're going to use within the brushes, the soft brush, airbrushing, change color to the second color on the top row, 80% size, 100% strength opacity, just towards the center and the top. So not quite in the center, just a little bit up from there. I'm going to tap that maybe 3 or 4 times, go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur that in to about the 70%, deselect, go back to the layers, slide and duplicate that layer, and we've really sort of spread that light color pretty far and wide on that canvas. Perhaps we'll just go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur that in another 20%. Go to our layers, we may as well just condense them together by pinching them. Then we can go and create a new layer. I'm going to go to our brushes, I'm going to go to organic, rainforest. But by default, the rainforest's individual bits of texture are quite close together. So if we tap on it, go to the stroke path, we can increase the spacing all the way up to about 50%. Don't change anything else. I'm going to go to our colors, and we're going to use the third color on the top row. I'm going to put the brush size at 5%. And maybe just a little bit back from 100% opacity, and just go and do a line of this across, maybe bring in some more. Then we're going to put it up 7%, just a little bit down from there, 10%, a little bit further down. We can just give a few passes of that, 15%, we'll just bring it all the way down. Then I'm just going to reduce the size of the brush again to maybe 3% and the strength down to 50%. And we can just add a few suggestions of texture in here. And it is pressure sensitive, so if you press on more, you get bigger shapes, and a bit less, you get smaller ones. We'll just add a few more in here in the mix, maybe a few around the edge, and then just close some of the bigger gaps down a little bit. Not completely, but a little bit. I'm then going to go to my airbrushing soft brush, put the size down to 4%, and again not fully at the top, so 90% strength. If that's less than that, let's go more like the 50 again. And we can just start to collect some of these shapes together. We've got that texture that's really got us most of the way there, but we can just bunch it together in places just to create some bigger shapes. Why not? It bunched together a little bit more. Then we'll turn it down to 2% and just get in there a little bit more in some of the gaps too. Shouldn't take too long just to do this area. And we are going to use the blur in a moment to soften this in, so if it still looks a little bit patchy in places, don't worry too much. So we'll go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we'll blur that in to about the 5%. Then I'm going to put that brush up to 15% size. And again, I'm just going to get in there and just tidy some of that bottom area up. Might as well put the opacity to 100% too. There you go. So we'll just shut down any patchiness in that lower area now. So all the texture really is just in that upper region. I'm then going to go to that layer. I'm going to tap on it. I'm going to put on Alpha Lock. I'm going to stick with a soft brush with an airbrushing, but I'm going to change colours. The fourth colour on the top row. I'm going to keep the brush size at, say, 15%, and I don't want it 100% strength, so I'll put it down to about 50. I'm just going to brush in from the edges here and here, some extra darkness. I did a little bit more as well, just at the side. And then for this bottom section, I'm going to add some darkness too. So pretty much the bottom third. I might even put the opacity up for this section down here, like so. Then I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur that in to about the 70%. Deselect. I'm going to go to my layers and create a new layer, layer 4. Stick with a soft brush with an airbrushing. Go to my colours. I'm going to go for the fifth colour, which is pretty much a black colour. 15% size, 100% opacity. And I'll just add this to the bottom section. Again, just bring it up to about a third of the way up, something like this. Doesn't need to be a straight line. Then the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur that to about the 50%. And it's just darkened up this bottom section quite nicely. I'm going to go to my layers again, create a new layer, layer 5. Still with the soft brush with an airbrushing, go back to my colours. I'm going to choose the 6th colour, 15% size, 100% opacity, and then really we're just dealing with this bottom section here. And just a little bit up from it, like so. Then I'm going to go on that layer, tap on it, put on the Alpha Lock. I'm going to go back to my colours, and I'm going to go for the 7th colour. Still at the 15% size, 100% opacity still, and I'm going to add this to the centre area now. And I'm going to push this out, so we end up with just a section there and a section there. And then going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur that in to about the 60%. And just for good measure to intensify that, we'll go and duplicate that layer and then just pinch them together again, just so we're not getting too many different layers. I'm going to go to my colours. I'm going to choose the 8th colour, keep it at 15% size, 100% opacity, and I'm just going to do a section of that in the centre there. Maybe just push it that way and that way a little bit. And then again, I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur that in, this time to about 50%. Now I'm going to go to the first colour again on the top row, still with a soft brush on the same layer. I'm going to put it to 5% size and maybe about 20% strength. And I'm just going to go in there and just give that top edge a little bit of that intense blue once more. We're not going to see this centre area because of the tree anyway. We are going to notice it more on the outer edges, like so. Again to the adjustments, back to our friend, the Gaussian blur. We're going to blur that in about 10%. So we're using default brushes in this tutorial, but if you'd like to bring your art to the next level, you could try premium brushes from Brush Galaxy. Brush Galaxy enables you to unlock over 50,000 premium Procreate brushes for a fraction of the price, and you can access over 20 different categories such as fur, lettering, nature, animals, and many others. So for example, a quick search of snow and the results give you tons of different winter and snow brushes, which could be really useful for adding that extra something to your artwork. Start now and get the first 7 days for free and join thousands of other artists using Brush Galaxy tools to bring their art to the next level. The link is in the comments and in the description. Okay, back to our layers and create a new layer, layer 6. We're going to go in with the soft brush with an airbrushing still. We're going to go for the 8th colour. I'm going to put the brush size down to just the top end of 2% and 15% strength opacity. And I'll just zoom in, and then we're going to create a series of kind of curves like this. These are going to represent the highlights, the top of some shapes in the snow that are just catching the light of where the tree is going to be. The tree is going to be the predominant light source in this scene. There's going to be a secondary light coming from the environment, the blueness, but we're going to have a much more intense light coming from the center area. So anything that now is not flat on the ground is going to catch that light and reflect it back. So you can imagine if there's something down in this area directly underneath, it's going to get very much the top edge of it like this. Now if it's anything off on this side and it's facing the tree in the center, it's going to catch that side of a mound. Anything on this side, it's going to catch that side. So just to make that extra clear, there's your shape, there's your shape, and there's your shape. Depending on where it is positioned, if the light source is in the center, then it's going to hit it here, it's going to hit it here, or it's going to hit it there. Like I say, we're just kind of suggesting it at this stage, just creating some shapes. So I'm prioritizing this kind of a shape over on this side to represent it reflecting off the left side of any shapes that might be there. We don't need to worry too much about them just yet. On this side, it will predominantly hit the right side of any snowballs or rocks. Then as we come further down, it's just going to impact the top edge of those shapes more. Just subtly start to get some of that texture in initially. Then I'm going to go back to my colours, go back to the 7th colour again. 3% size, 15% opacity is enough. And some, these ones in the centre, are just going to start having a bit of weight to them. I'm going to start seeing some darker shapes emerge. Maybe turn it down, lower into the 2%. You can have some smaller things that are really in there as well. Getting slightly more granular in that center area. Back up, 3%. And this only works where we've got this lighter section. When we get further out, that color will actually appear lighter. And we can still use that, just like we used the other shapes. So we could, we can continue to build upon the highlights. That's not a problem. But it has a different impact here in this lighter area. It's just a touch, just a note darker. And that's good for what we want at this point. And like I say, you can continue to use this as well in the other areas. That's actually quite a useful colour to continue to build in those kinds of blobs and textures, just so it isn't too flat looking. Now on this layer, we may also stay on the same layer. We're going to go back. We may also use the 4th colour on the top row still. Put it down to, well, the lowest part of 2%. We want to be quite subtle with this initially, so only 10% strength. Just zoom in a bit. And some of these shapes are going to have a shadow on the underside. So we can further kind of have them standing out by creating a little bit of a shadow. And that will become more relevant, probably on the edges too, where maybe we see more of a shadow than anything else. Like so, and then we can just do the same thing over on this side. You can start to just see them emerging out of the landscape there a bit more clearly. The more we kind of put a little bit more definition on them, the more crystallized they kind of become. Ease up on the darkness in the center. We could go for something slightly lighter. So maybe we'll go for this color, 6th color on the top row. We can still get in some of those shadows, but it's just slightly less dark in this area perhaps. And I feel like I need to go back to some highlights. I'm going to go really strongly now. So I'm going to go for the 9th color, 2% size, perhaps a little bit even stronger, 20% opacity. Zoom in. Maybe we should even just create a new layer for this, layer 7. That way if we go too strong in with this, we can always go backwards or subdue it. So we're just adding now some of that highlight onto the very top. Going to keep it kind of rounded. Obviously, the more snow it collects, the more kind of soft and round those shapes will become, typically. You don't want to be too angular. Just think about the roundness of shapes. Think about the top edges. Add some of these highlights in there. Especially in the center area. Think about how the light is hitting it, whether it's hitting on the left because the object is on the right, or hitting it on the right because the object is on the left. Just constantly remind yourself where the light source is going to be, somewhere in this region, or in this whole area in fact, and therefore it's going to be impacting all of these items. I'm going to put the brush up to 2% size, down to 10% strength, and I'm just more generally going to bring in some kind of rolling color that just goes in and out of some of these shapes. We've obviously got the actual ground level too, as well as these. It shouldn't be just one kind of texture. We've got the combination of the two things. So we've got the ground texture and the texture of the actual kind of balls of snow as well. Might put it up in fact to 3% size and just have these sweeping stretches of snow cutting across too. I think that just does pretty good at softening them in a little bit more. We don't want these to be too jarring, like I was saying. They need to appear kind of soft. Let's bring these sweeping gestures across the snow just to kind of soften them into the environment a little bit better. Just be mindful of some of these. Perhaps you don't want to go too strong. I am pressing lightly. It is only at 10%, but I could press more or I could press less, and I'm very much kind of gliding and building up gradually. So if you are quite heavy-handed, then sometimes my percentages on my brushes, you might need to adjust them slightly lower if you struggle with just being really gentle. Another thing to bear in mind is that the camera that I use sometimes oversaturates the colors. And so you might be looking at my version and think it looks more vibrant, more colorful, and yours doesn't. But that's why I give the codes. So don't worry about that. I've given you the correct colors, the correct codes. So you are using the same colors as me. And yeah, it just might look a little bit more subdued than it does here on camera. However, if by the time you've finished, you want yours to be just more vibrant, when you save it to your images on the iPad, you can always then go into the edit the settings within your photos and you can just ramp up the saturation, and that does a really nice job at just kind of matching perhaps more closely what you see on camera if you feel it's necessary. Now, obviously, I'm creating this to look good in front of me, and I don't really think about what's going on in the camera. So if you want it to look closest to what I'm producing, what I think looks good, then the color codes will get you there. So I've done quite a lot of streaks to soften that in a little bit more. I'm going to go to the end color, 10th color on the top row, turn it down again to 2% size, still at the 10% opacity. And again, we're just going to build in some of this brightness, and it's really nice now just to intensify some of this in the center area. And we're not going to put much of this light color on the edges. We're just increasing the amount of light in the center area. And we'll probably come back to this and intensify it even further later on. So we don't need to do all of it just yet. So that will do for this stage. We'll just get rid of that little point in the center there. It doesn't need to be there, so let's get rid. Go back to our layers and we'll create a new layer, layer 8. We're going to go to our brushes, we're going to go to the organic, and we're going to go to the paper daisy brush. Now we're going to use this for all of the texture and the creation of the tree itself, which might seem a bit strange, but I'll show you with this bright color. Once we've got it, say 100% and a small size, you only really perceive it as a line. And the more we increase it in size, it just becomes texture. It's only when you get really big that you start to notice the actual texture of it. So we're going to use it as like a textured line for the most part. Now we aren't going to use that color, so we'll go to our colors. We're going to use the first color on the middle row. We're going to put the size at the lowest part of 2%. We're going to put it 100% opacity so we can really see it. And in the center there, I'm just going to bring a line down to where I want it to end. I'm going to hold it and it will snap to a straight line. So that is going to be the location and pretty much the size of the tree. Now I'm going to put it down even further, down into the 1%. We're going to zoom in for our tree details. And we're going to have some branches that stick out, and then they may subdivide somewhat. So again, we're going to zoom in a bit more. And then they have subdivisions. Come to the next. Now you don't want to get too long too soon. And you also need to, just generally think about how long you want the branches or whatever to be down here. So if you wanted to have a little bit of a guide in there, you could do, but I'm going to be able to judge it by eye enough, I think. So again, get the main branches in there, then subdivide it. Main branches, subdivide. And if you've ever had like a fake plastic tree and you've had all these little branches and you've had to spread out all the individual parts of the branch, then you're probably quite familiar with how these might be formed. Not 100% natural, obviously, but for the sake of this, that's quite a good thing to bear in mind. You're going to have some bits that stick out at the edges that are going to be more noticeable, and we are going to use that for the most part. Now, much of this tree, as we get into the center, I'm actually going to just blot out, so you don't really see a lot of this center texture. I suppose really what we're looking for is the outer edge, but we may as well have the full run of the tree. Now, if you're a real tree expert, you might just be looking at the way I'm creating this and think, well, that's not how a real tree is, and it doesn't really matter. It creates the effect, and that's all we're really looking for. So we'll get some main branches in there. You don't all have to be next to each other too. Could be something like this. And then what we're really looking for are these ones at the edges. So maybe we'll just spend some time just concentrating on those. Once you kind of get familiar with the kinds of textures, you don't really have to even worry about how they match up to that pattern as such. Then I'm going to put the brush size up to maybe 3%. And then, as I was saying before, we're just looking to blot in much of this anyway. Certainly up to kind of like this point, it's going to become more sparse as we get up there perhaps. But in this center area, we can really just start to blot in this black area. So I'll put that up to 5%. That center area. So it's not just going to be the branches. It's not just going to be all the individual little pine needles. It's also going to be snow and other things that are helping create this silhouette. So just blot it in. I'm just tapping it in. Perhaps I'll turn the strength down to 50. And we can just have a bit more of a softness as we get towards the edge then. We definitely want some of those bits that are sticking out, but we also want to just kind of soften it in a bit more. Allow it to close down, shut down much of the light there. And again, just tap it in there a little bit. Some little bits of suggestions of light peeking through is no bad thing. There you go. Perhaps I'll just put it back down to a smaller size, 2%. Please excuse the sounds that might be coming into the video. It's really windy outside. It may be coming through in the video. I'm not sure. So if you wonder what the strange sounds are, it's possibly the wind outside. It's a really windy day here in the UK. So it feels quite nice to be painting something that was a little bit more serene, a little bit calm, because it's pretty windy outside. Okay, so that's given us the kind of overall texture and silhouette. Now we'll just go back to my brushes, the airbrushing medium brush. I'm going to put that at top end of 2%, 100% opacity, and I'm just going to build in a nice tree trunk. Now it's probably going to be obscured in some sense, but it's nice to have it there anyway. Perhaps a little bit further down, in fact, where it joins. Okay, I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to tap on the new layer and put on clipping mask, which means that anything that I add to this layer now isn't going to extend beyond the boundaries of the main Christmas tree. You can see it stops really conveniently no matter what I do. So it won't go into the background, which is great. I'm going to go to my colours, middle row, second colour. I'm going to stay on the Paper Daisy brush. I'm going to have it at 4% size and about 50% opacity. Again, on that second colour, on the middle row. And I'm just going to lightly start to tap in some of this texture. Now obviously I can press on more and you get a slightly more apparent texture, although even then it's quite subtle. So I want to build this in gradually. I'm going to use lots of different colours, so I don't want to go in too much too soon, because then it doesn't leave a lot of room for other colours to show through. Same settings, and you can just tap in, and you can go right up to the edge, it's not a problem. Just tap it in. Maybe we could even put it up from 4% to 5%. Why not? Just randomly kind of scatter this in, hoping creating some texture and variation in that tree. I think it's a really nice way of just giving it some depth. Again, we don't want to do too much of this though. Okay, so stay on the same layer. We're going to go to the third colour on the middle row, and we'll do the same thing again. Now it's definitely going to be more apparent, so just be mindful of that. Scatter it in, be mindful, zoom in if you need to, just to see the impact it's having. Now obviously when we really scrutinize that texture, it's not exactly right, but it's not going to be seen underneath so many of the things that we're going to be adding, and it's appropriate enough of a texture for it to work. So I'm not too worried about that. Again, don't press on too hard with this. Keep it as individual points and scatter it in as much as possible. Otherwise you get a real condensed area like that. I'm not too worried. Can always just add some snow over the top of that, or some lights even. We'll see. And then obviously we need to add that all the way to the very top. Maybe it should really by rights be a little bit smaller, the texture nearer the top. So maybe down into the 3%. Finer texture near the top. Okay, stay on the same layer. We're going to go to the, where are we up to? We're on the fourth colour now, which isn't dramatically brighter, but it is brighter. We're still at the 3%, so let's put it back up to the 4%. It's quite a big difference really, so just be mindful of that. Don't need to add a huge amount of this. We're starting to get to the point now where we've got quite a lot of texture in there anyway, and I think it's starting to work nicely. So maybe we'll go to the fifth colour, which is definitely start to go a lot brighter. So just be mindful. Start to add it a little bit more carefully. Again, just sort of scatter it in. Zoom out, see how we're looking, and then we'll go along to the sixth colour. So we're getting towards the areas of real brightness now, so we might want to consider just pushing this slightly differently. So we'll go back to our layers and we'll create a new layer. Again, we're going to tap on it, put on the clipping mask, and we're going to go to our brushes again, this time airbrushing soft brush. We're going to stay with this colour, so that's the sixth colour. I'm going to put the brush size to maybe 3%, and I'm going to put it down to 5% strength initially, and I'm just going to start building in at the edges some of this brightness. And so you start to notice some of these little bits that will stick out. Certainly when we have a dark background, then it's going to make them more noticeable. We can use that to our advantage just to bring them out a little bit more clearly. But we don't necessarily need to do as much of it near the top, but we'll see. And it's probably still going to stand out as being darker near the top compared to some areas of the background anyway. So it's not a problem. We may also just continue to build up this brightness around the edge, adding a nice glow. Okay, so I've kind of scribbled that around the edge somewhat. And I think what I'd like to do with that layer is slide and duplicate it. And the bottom version, I'm going to slide and put it underneath layer 8. Now it seems a bit strong at that point. So we'll tap on it, go to the N, turn it down first of all to about 50%. And then I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm actually going to blur it in to about the 40%, and it's just going to help with this sense of a glow around it. Obviously we've got some bright lights that are going to be added to this, and if you just remove the glow or add it, you can see that it is impacting. We could have gone for something like blend mode on add, arguably, but actually I think it does the trick on the normal blend mode anyway, so we'll leave it as that. Now I did come up with this color palette initially, and I'm starting to think that it looks a little bit too warm orange, almost looks like a tree that has no life in it. So I am going to go with that whole layer, go to the adjustments, hue, saturation and brightness, and on the hue I'm going to change it from 50. I'm only going to nudge it a bit. I don't want to change it too radically. I'm going to put it up to about 57, and it just adds a hint more of that green that I think does belong there, gives it a little bit more life. Okay, so we're going to create a new layer, layer 12, and we're going to try a different brush. I'm going to try within drawing the Evolve brush. The reason I'm trying that is that it is pressure sensitive, so when you press lightly you're going to get smaller marks, and you press more you're going to get bigger shapes, and also it has a little bit of a texture to it as well. I'll just clear that layer, and we're going to use the 7th colour on the top row. We're going to put the brush size at around 5%, maybe about 90% opacity. We can always turn the opacity of the whole layer down if we need to. And I don't want to be too destructive of everything that we've got, but we do need to start adding some snow. So I'm going to use some light amounts of texture on the edges, and then as we come more towards the center, we can have more of a gathering of bigger shapes, and then just lightly touch it towards the edges again. Now, I don't want to do every part. Maybe I can aim for the top part or some sections. Imagine how the snow might actually gather. Now, it's not going to be completely regular or consistent. It's going to be just a little bit random. But I do want to add a little bit of a dusting of snow all the way. Have some of the texture remaining that we've created. I was pleased with the overall look, so I don't want to do so much of this that we lose everything that we've done. And if you don't like this as a feature, then you don't even have to add this on. Now it will look a little bit strange if it has no snow on it whatsoever, but it is still something that you don't have to add to your tree. Now we can still see it through the gaps. It's still there, it's still visible. You can decide how much to add. Now I'm pressing very lightly towards the edges, allowing it to fragment a little bit. Some larger shapes, as I was saying, in the central areas. Maybe I'm going to aim for areas where we have a lot of black areas anyway, so I don't mind filling those up with the snow texture. Perhaps avoid some of the highlights, because if we want them to stand out, we want them to remain. Just kind of work between them a little bit, and then just add them onto the edges a little bit. And obviously as we get further down, the amount of snow that gathers is likely to be more concentrated, bigger amounts. So let's bear that in mind. Bigger clumps and clusters. And I think something like that will do for my tree. And like I say, you can still see enough of the texture remaining through. You can see it with or without the snow. You can choose whether to add it. I think it would look a little bit strange in that environment not to have it, so it makes sense to have it. Then we're going to go to that layer and we're going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we're going to blur it. Not huge amounts, but maybe if you zoom in you can see the impact it has. So there's at nothing, and if you zoom it in and blur it, somewhere between the 2 and 3%, I think, just a little bit under 3, I think works. Then go to the layer settings, tap on it, put on alpha lock. Stay on the same brush that we've just been using, but I'm going to go for a lighter color. I'm going to go for the 8th color, and I'm going to turn the strength of it down to about 30%, but I'll keep the same size at 5%. And I'm just going to start adding some highlights of this. In fact, I might even turn that down. Even at 30% it's quite strong, so I'm going to put it down to 10. I want it to be a little bit more subtle, and you're pressing on lightly. Remember to just have a smaller impact. So we want the top half of it to have a slightly lighter colour. Now we have a bit more light in the upper area from the sky, so it's just going to be bouncing that light around a little bit. You don't need to do an excessive amount of this, just a little bit. Probably more noticeable on the larger shapes. Perhaps we could even turn the brush size down a little bit more to just to the 2%. That way you can control where it goes a little bit more accurately. Just move it around as necessary, just get highlights on the top of some of these larger shapes. Okay, now I think just that adds a little bit more depth, a little bit more substance to those shapes. We could even go backwards, maybe to the black color. Maybe that's a bit dark. Maybe we'll go to the 4th color on the top row. Same brush, 2% size, still at the 10% opacity. And again, we still have the alpha lock on. And you could even add just a little bit of extra shadow on the underneath for any sort of snow that's just perhaps a little bit more in the shadow. Again, it doesn't need to be something that's labored on particularly, just kind of fleeting attention to it, and that's enough. Go to the layer and turn off the alpha lock. Have another look at it. Perhaps we can blur it in even more, so go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we'll just blur it in another 2%, and I think that just sits a little bit better. Okay, then we're going to add a new layer, layer 13. We're going to change the blend mode from normal by tapping on the end, scrolling down to add. We're going to go in with the luminance light pen. We're going to go to our colors. We're going to choose the first color on the bottom row. We're going to have the size at 40% and the opacity at 70%. And we're going to zoom in and we're going to add some lights on our tree. I'm going to stick around the edge to begin with. If you press once, you get a different effect than pressing it a few times. If you press on lightly, you get a difference than pressing on quite a lot. So I'm going to do a little bit of a variety. I'm probably going to stick with some smaller ones just for this edge initially. I don't want to do too many. Certainly on the edge of a kind of cone shape, when you've got this kind of a detail, you're going to have a clustering more so than you will do in the center. But I'm also a little bit mindful as I don't want to do too many of them. Now in the endeavor to do this tutorial, I have done one where I did too many. And so this is my second run at the lights. I did too many and it just didn't work, I feel. So this is my second run where I'm trying to be a little bit more conservative, and even that looks quite a lot. So we'll see how this goes. Adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we'll blur it in slightly, not too much, maybe about 3%. Then I'll go to the adjustments again, go to bloom, and we'll scroll it all the way up to 100%. And it just really gives them a better sense of glow. Add another layer, layer 14, and we'll stay on the same brush, the same settings, but I'm going to make these lights a little bit more prominent in this front area. And we can allow them to sit closely together in places, but I also want to be just keeping them a little bit more spaced apart. Again, just be mindful, sometimes less is better, less is more. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. So add as many as you think will lift this image and really make it work. I think that's approaching about the right amount, because you don't want to lose some of the other details. You don't want to lose the tree texture underneath it. You don't want to lose the snow either. And again, we could try the adjustments, bloom. Let's push that up, and you can see whether you like it with the bloom or without it. I think it adds something, but I don't want to do too much of it. So I'm going to put it, well, from 0 up to about 15%. I think it does help. It does make it work. Now looking at the layer, I'm actually going to change it from normal to add. Honestly, it doesn't make a huge difference, but we'll put it on add anyway. Just makes it even brighter. We're going to go to our layers. I'm going to create a new layer, layer 15. This time I am going to keep the blend mode on normal. I'm going to use the luminance light pen still. I'm going to put it to 100% size and 100% opacity, and I'm still going to use the first orange, and I'm going to go to the peak of the tree, and then I'm going to go a little bit beyond that, and I'm going to press on really quite hard with that brush to create a really nice burst of light at the top. And then with the same brush, I'm going to turn the opacity down to about 20% and just the size of it down to about 50. And then from that center point, we're going to bring out some beams. Turn it around from the center point, bring out some beams. Maybe we could just even turn it down further, 15%. From the center out. Now once we've got those shapes, I'm going to go back to layer 14 where the blend mode is on add. I'm going to stay on this orange, and I'm just going to further enhance these, and some new ones even. And it's just subtly going to lighten them up, a bit lighter, a bit less saturated, more of the white, especially for the darker kind of areas. We're going to add another layer on top of that, but again we are going to change the blend mode from normal to add. Stay with the same brush and color, but we're going to work on top of these and it will just help bring them out. I wanted some of the warmth that you get by using the normal blend mode. You get a real saturation of color. Sometimes when you just use the add blend mode, you lose some of that. Just keep rotating them, work from the center out, keep looking, reviewing how it's working, extend some of them out even further, all the main ones. Extend this down perhaps into the tree a bit more dramatically. Maybe turn it down even lower to 20% size so we can really get a thin beam down here onto the tree. Important to turn it because it's very easy to not get the angle right, as I just did there. Just demonstrated how not to do it. So turn it, go from the center, and it is much easier to orientate from the center and get the right angle that you need, so to speak. Just work on that center area, maybe just extend some of the spikes there a little bit more as it gets closer. Okay, I think that's starting to work quite nicely. I'm going to go to the bottom area, and I might as well stay on layer 16. I'm going to go to the airbrushing soft brush, however. I'm going to stick with the orange first color. We may not use all of those vibrant colors. Sometimes I just select them as an option. I'm going to put the size to about 5%, but low on the opacity at around 10. Just in this bottom area, I'm going to increase kind of the impact on the ground, the base of the tree there a little bit. Just go in there and use this now to maybe just exaggerate some areas, bring out that glow. Go over some of the big points of light, just ramp it up a little bit. Zoom out, see how it's looking. Again, just continue to ramp this up as you see fit. And then I'm going to work on the snow area as well. So I'm going to turn it down this time to 2% size, stay at the same color and the same opacity. In fact, even 2%. We'll go for the lowest part of 2% just before it becomes 1. And then we can start adding some of these real highlights into the ground area now. So it's going to bounce directly back some of the light that's in the tree a little bit better. And then more generally, perhaps we could put it up again to the 3%, and we can just, whole base of the tree there perhaps just needs to be a little bit lighter. And then we're going to start to see that the trunk, actual bottom of the tree, is going to look too dark for that context. So probably the next thing we need to do is go back to that silhouette, back onto that layer, and then, well, probably with the eraser set to the soft brush, 2% size, 30% opacity or so, and then we can just start to soften that in. The bottom edge, just have it kind of disappearing a little bit. Not that it isn't there, it's just, yeah, we don't want it to be too noticeable compared to everything else. We've really subdued it back, and then we can go back to the top layer, back to our brush again, and again, perhaps we'll turn it down back to the, well, we'll try 1% actually, and we can just maybe light up the sides of this tree trunk. Just run that line across the very base as well to separate the branches from the trunk. Then we could always try now with the yellow colour. Keep at the top end of 1%, maybe turn that up to 20% strength, opacity. And then we can start bringing in some real brighter colours in the mix there as well. So we're getting a significantly brighter impact there at the base. The orange got us so far, but now we're using this to push it even further. So I might just turn that up to 3% size, 10% opacity, and just bring that across the base area there, bring out a significant glow. So we'll turn it back down to the lowest part, 2%, still at the 10% opacity. And yeah, we're just going to add that in the mix. We don't want to have the yellow be too apparent. It's going to be just a pushing of things a little bit further, but we don't want the yellow over here, for example. It's going to jar too much with the blue. So wherever we've got the strong orange colour, perhaps we can push it even further with that yellow. So we'll alternate perhaps between the orange and that yellow. The orange we can extend even further. Maybe we could use the red to extend that further back even. So it still has the warmth and the impact, but it's just not quite as strong. Go back to the orange, zoom in, just scribble that orange in a little bit more, get a little bit more free. Just a few trails of texture there in the background, just so there's a suggestion of there's more things back there. Just lightly pressing smaller elements of texture. Back to the yellow, and then again, just as it gets really significantly near the tree, it's going to bounce the lightest of colours there. We don't want that to go beyond that central area really. Perhaps I'll go back to the orange, put the soft brush up to 10%, turn the opacity down even further to 5%, and then I'm just going to generally just hug it around the actual tree itself. I think that works better. Maybe into the ground area a little bit more further, like so. That's working. We need perhaps to go back and add some shadows onto the snow. We had it on layer 6 all the way back there, so we'll go perhaps in with the 4th colour on the top row. Soft brush with an airbrushing, 2% size and about 30% opacity. Go back to some of these details, bring in some more concentrated shadow. I think it's going to be a little bit more necessary to bring out some of these shapes, give them a bit more volume, a bit more substance. So yeah, let's get in there, add some more shadow areas in the mix. There's nothing wrong with sort of scribbling in some more areas there to be a bit more free with it. And we can start to even creep it into the center areas here more. And that is quite black, so we'll go for maybe the 3rd colour again on the top row, and maybe we could just blend that in a little bit with a more of a blue colour as well. Just soften it in if it's necessary in any areas. One more thing we could do is go back to layer 12, tap on it, put on the alpha lock, go in with the airbrushing soft brush, go in with the orange, and I'm going to put it to 2% size, maybe 15% opacity, and anywhere that's really close to a light source, I can just really push in the impact it has on the snow in that kind of localized area. And it's not a necessary thing to do, but I just think it ties it into its environment a little bit better then. So the lights actually impact on the snow. I think it makes sense that they would. Anywhere where the light is, it needs to have a little bit of an impact. We can go to the yellow too. We could also create a new layer above it, tap on it, put on clipping mask, and that does the same job basically. But it does allow us then to change the blend mode from normal to add, and go back in with the orange, and just, it's a little bit more subtle. Has that glow that we were aiming for, as I was explaining before, and you can see that actually it works a little bit better, arguably. And then we can really make the snow seem like it's reacting to the elements around it. So whenever you've got a light really close to the snow, it needs to bounce that light around. It's a subtlety, but I do think it actually makes a difference to the snow. I think it looks better for it. And it just makes the snow, it stops it looking so kind of lifeless, ties it into all the other elements just a little bit better. And yeah, I'm happy with the way that that looks and ties all together. Look back through the layers, I'm going to layer 13 and I'm just testing it out, duplicate it. So you can see it with or without or with on the edges of the tree. I think it's probably better with. You could always go for a compromise of that. So you could take one of the versions, put it to 50%, then you get, yes, it has ramped it up, but maybe not as much as all that. And so you can see that it does make a difference. We've also got layer 10. You could slide and duplicate that. Again, test it without or with. I think I like it better with. Maybe just dial it back a little bit, put it to 70%. Again, test it without or with. I think it does make it glow. And then we've also got layer 10 we put in there for a general glow. Now we had it on normal. We could perhaps put it to add. We could slide and duplicate it again. And again, it's just pushed that general glow even further, which again, I think works better. So I think I prefer it with the extra glow. Now, admittedly, on camera, the glow does look a little bit more intense than it does in person when I'm looking at my iPad. So that may be a factor. You judge yours on how it looks, obviously. One minor change that I might make, I'm a little bit concerned that that area is a bit too big. So go back to layer 15, go to the transform, uniform setting, and you can just pinch it from the corner, make it smaller, put it up into that central area. Perhaps you just need to zoom in to make sure that it is going in the center. That looks better. I'm just going to go back to layer 6, go in with the smudge and soft brush airbrushing. I'm going to put it to, well, maybe about 15% size, 50% opacity, and just here on the edges, if it's just a little bit, I don't know. I didn't think it was as neat as it could be. Doesn't matter, it's going off at the edge. Just tap this in a few times, soften it in. It doesn't need to be as distinct as all that. You can have it slightly less in focus at the edges anyway. Okay, something I noticed on camera that doesn't necessarily appear here when I'm looking at my iPad is that the top layer seems to have really bleached out everything but a few points there. Now, it's not quite as dramatic when I look at it in person, but just to open up some of those areas again and go back to the top layer with the eraser, set to the soft brush, 2% size, 15% opacity, and I'm just going to open up some of these areas just so it doesn't look quite so odd on camera, but honestly it doesn't look quite the same in person anyway. But now I've seen it on camera, it's just made me super aware of any little issue with it when I look at it directly with my eyes as well. So I'm just going to open them up a little bit more, maybe put it up to 5% size, still at the 15% opacity. And yeah, just subdue it slightly more in that center area. Maybe extend that a little bit further towards the edges too. Okay, that looks a little bit better on camera. It looks a little bit better in person as well. I'm going to show you a still in a moment at the end so you can see exactly how it looks for me. But obviously you might want to just get the balance right for yourself. So I'm going to leave it here at this point. I hope you've enjoyed following along. If you have, please give the video a comment, maybe a suggestion of something I could do in my next tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe, and I shall catch you back here soon. Bye for now.